Hello and welcome to the Quantum Bridge with myself, Casper, my perennial co-host, Gary, somewhere here. How are you?
I'm good, thank you, mate. Yourself?
Yeah, despite the fact that, as you've said before we started to record, we've had like every season in a day
Yeah,
and continue to have that. Other than that, yeah, fine. And
yeah.
because I'm English, I'm going to stop talking about the weather and please introduce for a second time our lovely guest, who we're very pleased to have back with us.
It is. It is great to welcome back Hannah for a second time. Welcome to the show, Hannah. How are you doing today?
Hi guys, I'm doing really well. I know in the last episode we talked about how I was going to be coming back to Texas. So I ended up coming back to Texas. So I'm finally settling in, and it's been really awesome.
Excellent. It's good. Nice to hear things going smoothly in this sort of
Yeah, yeah, that's right. It's a
tumultuous
rarity.
times. Yeah.
Whereabouts in Texas, by the way, Hannah?
So I'm currently located probably about 40 minutes outside of Austin.
Oh, okay, great, nice.
Brilliant.
Yeah, it's a really, really great area. Very like community oriented. Everybody's like super into local, buying local and all of that stuff. So
Mm,
it's really awesome.
excellent. So,
Yeah, don't say too much because we'll end up dropping
yeah.
in on you, and that's the last thing anybody wants to.
Yeah.
I see
Yeah,
you
there's
growing
there's
things.
definitely some weirdos out there.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you got two here, so yeah. Anyway, Gary.
Yeah, so now, Lou, you confused me now. We're going to talk about manifestation. That's why we got Hannah back today. Is that still okay, Hannah? We know you got some downloads last night. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
so maybe I'll pass it over to you and you can sort of frame how you see manifestation and then we'll sort of take it from there, if that's okay.
Yeah, that sounds good. So I mean, I teach a lot about it on my channel. I've been kind of like aiming my content more towards that particular area of interest, primarily because it's just a very popular topic, especially like within the spiritual community. I think a lot of the first subjects that people kind of get into when they get into this work is manifestation. And a lot of it is because I think at first it really does appeal to the ego. You know what I mean? It's like you hear this idea of like, oh, I can have what I want. I can live a life that I desire to live. I think that for anybody like naturally is very tempting and it's something that is very enticing. So it definitely does attract a lot of people into the world of esoterica as a whole. And I always talk about this in my videos. Like I see manifestation as something that is merely a facet of a much larger web of truths that make up our cosmic existence. So with every person that kind of gets into this stuff and activates this power within themselves, they're really operating as a mere fractal of a whole. So it's kind of like this system of awakening that's going on right now with all of these souls waking up to the multidimensional nature of our universe. They're really being able to activate these abilities to shift within the realities of this universe. Um, and the basic principle that I kind of teach on my channel and through this work is that we are ultimately the God of our subjective reality. And that sounds kind of like weird for some people. And I've noticed that when I bring this subject up, even among mystics, like it almost kind of equates to if you would have said a dirty word, like some people react very strangely when you tell them that they're God. And it's not really to say that we're the supreme deity or like the supreme overlord of everyone and everything, but of our subjective experience, we absolutely do have way more power and influence than we've been led to believe within the mainstream. So
I
that's
mean,
kind of
I,
what
I
I
do struggle
focus
with that, Hannah. You know, Casper tells me this sort of stuff. And I say it's one thing hearing it, but to embody that, I must say, I find that difficult when I just go to work in a warehouse and I can't get out of it. And I'm like, and that's daily struggle. And you just think, man, I sort of, I'm hearing one thing, it's a different reality. Like I say, just trying to embody that, I do find that difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a major, major responsibility. And I think that's part of what makes it so, I think, weird for some people to really embrace and embody is it really requires a person to kind of step outside of themselves and see a bigger picture. And I think a lot of people have a hard time doing that. And it's not because there's anything wrong with them. It's primarily because we've just been brought up in a system that completely severs that connection with people. You know, it's like you were saying, like you go to your warehouse job like that, you know, in a or a stereotypical description of God, like that doesn't sound very like godly, you know what I mean? So I think people kind of see that and they're just like, well, how would I be God? But even in the most like mundane of actions and the things that we see as just kind of like regular everyday experiences, ultimately are creations from within our subconscious mind, and they're projections of certain beliefs onto the matter that creates our experience. So, you know, a lot of people have a really hard time embracing that fact. And I see why. And I think there's a lot of institutions that also fuel the severance between that knowing and that connection from people to themselves. You know, you have on one hand, you know, you have the strict aspect of like dogmatic religion that, you know, is telling people that they have to live by a certain system or a certain way of being. And a lot of times that way of being involves them answering to some sort of external deity. And I think for a lot of people, it's just easier and more palpable to believe in some sort of external deity because, again, it requires less responsibility. You know, you don't have to really be as self-accountable. You can just kind of give it up to something outside of yourself, like, you know, all of your blessings and misfortunes. You know, you can see it as like coming from something else, and you don't really have to take accountability or responsibility for it.
Mm.
And on the other hand, you know, we have these institutions like the dogmatic scientific community, who ultimately is kind of its own religion in and of itself, or it's become its own religion. You know, you have that end of the spectrum telling people that, you know, all of this is a bunch of BS and it's completely, you know, it's kind of like fantasy to believe in this. So you have these two different polarized ideologies that are pulling us back and forth, you know what I mean? And I think that's what makes it so hard for people to really embody this, is that the programming and the conditioning runs so deep that, you know, that programming of disempowerment, of, you know, kind of convincing people that they're merely just these bugs on a floating rock in the middle of space.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah. Well, without going into my whole psyche too much, but like I say, I'm sort of that in between thing. I struggle, like I said, with one way, but I'm very. I really don't like externalizing my power. You know, I that sort of repels me. I said it doesn't feel right at all to me. So it's a sort of a weird situation to be in between. I have to say for myself, of trying to. On the one hand, I feel very powerful inside, but the external experience maybe doesn't match, and I'm always like, what is going on here? You know. I mean, I'm saying that is changing over the last few years, of course, you know, because we're all, whatever, I don't know, we would call it being activated or switched on even more than we were, or certainly for myself, you know, it's another hit over the head. But yeah, I do find that sort of weaving in between these things, in and out. I don't know why, but it's currently where I'm at, I suppose. Yeah.
I mean, it's definitely not just you. I think that's something that we all deal with, you know, that back and forth. Like I was saying, you know, we have those two polarized ways of thinking kind of pulling us back and forth. There's also just all kinds of different beliefs and perceptions being shot at us from every which direction, all kinds of external stimuli, all of these things that ultimately impress upon our subconscious, and really influence the creation of our reality unconsciously. And I think this is kind of the, I don't want to say the lie, but like the misinformation that the modern mainstream manifestation community kind of spreads is just this idea of like, if you want it, you get it. You know what I mean? If you put it out there, it'll come to you. And, you know, I think for somebody who is adept at this work, at conscious manifestation, absolutely, that is exactly how it is. You think something and sometimes you get it within a day or, you know, even just within moments. Sometimes it can be instant. But in order to get to that point, it really does require a lot of deprogramming. And I think that's the thing that people don't really talk about in the mainstream manifestation world. They're starting to. I think there's people out on the internet that are kind of starting to talk about this more. But there really is a lot of deprogramming that has to go along with it, because we've been brought up on these beliefs that have created certain perceptions of ourselves, perceptions of our reality, that ultimately create certain results. So everything is perception. You know, everything that we're experiencing, it's all just a projection of ultimately our nervous system. So our nervous system is the computer that's really allowing us to interact with the world, and it's really creating our world out of various vibrational waves, and it's materializing into matter. So when you impress certain ideas onto your nervous system can then go forth and create that experience, because it doesn't know the difference between real or imaginary. So kind of the way to, I guess the formula for getting really good at this work is to identify old beliefs, identify beliefs that are keeping you in states of suffering, in states of repeated misfortune, because that's another thing that I think a lot of people don't really touch on is just the cycles of suffering that a lot of people are unconsciously putting themselves through. So there's a deprogramming aspect to it. And then there is a creation aspect to replace that old programming. And with that, it's really just about repetition, you know, repeating certain ideas, repeating certain I am statements. You know, I talked about in my video on Twitter the other day, some people have an easier time creating images or sounds or sensations in their mind, that, you know, they repeat over and over and over again to impress upon the nervous system. Because again, the nervous system doesn't know the difference between real and imaginary. And that's why anxiety and you know, cortisol production can be so deadly, because when we experience anxiety, it's literally telling your nervous system that you're not safe, you know, and that's what is kind of real. That's the reality for your nervous system. So when you can impress a certain reality upon your nervous system over and over and over again, it will create that reality. It has to.
Yeah.
It's interesting because it reminds me a lot of what you're saying, Hannah, about television and about programming in general, i.e. the self-programming, this thing also of stripping away of these layers of conditioning, as you're rightly pointing out, but also the power of a medium like the TV. You know, I know that there's other media, of course, now, not least, obviously, computer-based stuff. But just if we're thinking about the television and that concept that you're talking, well, it's not just a concept, but what you're talking about in terms of sort of our system and maybe our subconscious mind, depending upon, I know you're using the nervous system as your example, but this thing of whatever we watch, and particularly since many of us are drawn to this sort of more salacious content, or certainly content that is in some way exciting, which normally means there's an element or a lot of danger and stuff in it. You know, this thing of continually our system getting ready for some sort of massive onslaught, or believing that it's under that. It does seem that there's some sort of, in some way they're comparable, this whole thing of us as an entity and the TV and the programming, that maybe there's some sort of metaphor there too. But yeah, how do you feel about sort of what we're absorbing in the way, let's just talk for a moment about television and what that's done to us on a sort of maybe a group psyche level, perhaps.
Yeah, that's honestly an excellent topic to touch on. And it's a crucial one too, because it is absolutely an influence, especially because there's so many people consuming content from, you know, not even just TV, but like digital content online, like all of that stuff influences us. And it's in the word itself, TV programs, TV channels, you know, it's like that the etymology is there to show us the system or the process of what's occurring. Whenever we observe certain things, and it's common knowledge, and they've been very direct and open about this. There's subliminal marketing in TVs, or in TV shows and movies. They'll put products in the background, or they'll put certain, messages or certain things in the background that's not necessarily noticeable to the conscious mind, but it's impressing upon the subconscious. And that's really how programming works in any scenario, is really just taking something and allowing it to bypass the conscious mind and go directly into the subconscious so that it's created. And I think at some level, maybe not necessarily the people who are creating the movies and shows, I don't know, I mean, maybe some of them are in the know, but I definitely think on some level, somebody knows what's going on with all of this programming that occurs within the mass media. I don't know if you guys have heard of predictive programming.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah,
But feel free to touch on it in a way for people who, I'm sure many people watching will have done, but equally, I'm sure that there'll be people who don't. So just because we have, don't feel that you can't, touch on what that actually is.
Yeah. So, I mean, predictive programming is really just the process of these movies or TV shows having certain themes or ideas that are ultimately being impressed upon us so that we collectively create it. Because like I was saying, ultimately, we are the God of our subjective experience, but all of our realities come together and make the whole reality, the collective consciousness. So through the power of groupthink and through the power of group intention, a lot of these, films and these TV shows are putting in place certain things that are ultimately being created later down the line. And we see this a lot with like The Simpsons. I think The Simpsons is like a really famous example. People always talk about The Simpsons predicting everything. They're not predicting anything. They're putting out a certain subliminal idea into the collective consciousness, and it's being unconsciously created by the masses. So what people don't really understand is that this is also happening on an individual level too. We're not only projecting things on a collective level, we're projecting things on an individual level as well. And it's happening all the time. I mean, we're pretty much manifesting in every single moment. There's never a moment where it's not happening. It's either happening consciously or it's happening unconsciously. And when it's happening unconsciously, a lot of people think that life is just happening to them. They become, a victim of their own experience. And I think a lot of that has to do with stuff like TV programming and, programming from the mass media. They're allowing all of these external factors to impress upon them and really control them. And I think that's why a lot of people talk about, predictive programming being something that's really aimed to control the masses. But it's a choice, you know what I mean? You can either choose to see through the programming and understand the deeper truth and the deeper meaning to it, or you can become caught up in, the wave of programming. And a lot of people do. They don't know any better. You know what I mean? They don't have access to this knowledge.
It's there's something about that is that you can, as with everything, and coming back to your point about perspective generally anyway, is that you can flip this on its head, because you can say that people are victims of all of this inbound information, and then they are then going out and manifesting and repeating that manifestation of things that actually, if you ask them in the cold light of day, do you like this stuff, they'd say, no, I've got a horrendous life. But if you flip that on its head and say, you are manifesting it anyway, why wouldn't you manifest something that you want to move towards, that you love, like, that would give you joy, happiness, bliss, all these other things? And then they realize that they are manifesting already this darker and more sinister experience, that actually, it's only that flick of the switch, that pole shift, that would mean that suddenly they were out of disempowerment, they'd be incredibly empowered by what has been trapping them in the past, i.e. they've manifested a dark and depressing place. They can equally manifest something wonderful that they enjoy. So yeah. Maybe what you're saying is, part of this whole area is that, yeah, you are manifesting, in Gary's case, in a warehouse, in my case, doing certain things that I would probably rather not having to go out and do. And yet both of those are manifestations. And if they are, why don't we just tweak our manifestations a bit?
Yeah,
Can I just add to that, Hannah, quickly?
Yeah, of course.
Only just because I saw something like that online about that you're a master at these things. You know, when people say I want to move timelines or jump, they're like, you're manifesting this stuff all the time. You're a master at it, and it just maybe just becoming conscious of that. So,
Exactly.
I think that's yeah. I don't know how you feel about that.
Yeah, it's definitely just the process of consciously becoming aware and then catering that ability to, be geared towards whatever it is that you want to experience, which is definitely much easier said than done, I think, for a lot of people, because again, there's just a lot of programming that's there, the things that we've been brought up with from our caretakers, from the mass media. I mean, I think that our caretakers and, the ones who raised us are ultimately those who influence us the most. And I think we get a lot of our programming and a lot of the repeated cycles of suffering really do come from those who came before us. And I think that kind of touches on the idea of like ancestral karma and all of that stuff. Like we are ultimately just replications of DNA, and memory is stored in DNA. So the trauma of our ancestors is passed down through our bloodline, and a lot of us are unconsciously repeating that trauma. And as well as trauma from other lifetimes too. I think, the suppression of the idea of reincarnation is also a big factor in why why people are not aware of what their creations are bringing them. And I mean, that's pretty much the entire premise of Neville Goddard's work, is he talks about liberating a man from his past creations. I mean, that's essentially what this work is doing. It's liberating a person from their karma. Because their karma is really just all of the cycles of trauma and the cycles of action and consequence that we've created from an unconscious place, because maybe some lifetimes we didn't wake up, we just unconsciously created all of these patterns of suffering, and we brought those patterns with us into the current incarnation. And now here we are activating, becoming aware, maybe even having visions of these past lives, or having visions of these past experiences, and they're bringing themselves into our awareness so that we can identify them and clear them. Because ultimately, the only time something really has the most power over us is when we're unaware of it.
Yeah, good point. How are we for time going?
We've got about 9 minutes left.
Oh, okay, good, great.
That's okay.
Great. So we actually have got a few minutes. Fine. Yeah, look, I think you're touching on an area that and doing it incredibly well, by the way, Hannah, because this is tough stuff to get across, and to also get across without ego becoming too involved, particularly if you do feel that you can do these things, as we all can, but can consciously step into that space. And I think you're doing it's a wonderful example of somebody who obviously is in touch with this manifestation aspect within themselves, but who's not sort of saying, oh, come on guys, it's easy, let's get on with it. And because I probably would, if I was doing, or if I was recognizing more of my manifestations, I'd probably be like, oh look, this is in a typical egotistical sort of maybe male way. But just on that thing of ego, by the way, and not ego in the pejorative, in the negative sense really, but ego just in terms of a single identity. There is, when we're talking about something like manifestation, it always seems to me that this is just me, I've got this inner dialogue going on all the time of, yeah, I get that, and yeah, I'm sort of a magician anyway, so I can do all of that, and that's great, and I'm loving talking about this sort of thing, and maybe it's very empowering for people. And there is also sort of that sense, and I don't know, in your more esoteric sort of traditions and the stuff that you've looked into and the journeys that you've been on internally, have this more nebulous sense of ego and identity, i.e., is there anybody sitting at the center of all this, even within ourselves, making all these decisions about, I want a better life for myself? And I'm not saying that wouldn't be for others as well. If you're having a better life, you might mirror that and reflect that to all of your surroundings and to humanity as a whole, who knows? But I just want you to touch on that, because from a male perspective, or from my perspective, I definitely have got ego active there, and I'd like to claim that manifestation and claim that new world if I was bringing something more beautiful into my experience. Do you feel that way, or do you feel differently about that whole sense of it, of owning that manifestation?
Yeah, I mean, so it definitely is a tightrope for sure. I mean, you really do have to kind of walk between that balance of humble and, fully confident and self-assured, because it definitely, people fall into one category or the other. And I think both in excess are detrimental to the growth of the spirit. Ultimately, the ego itself is not necessarily a negative thing. I know it gets demonized a lot, just within spiritual circles. A lot of people talk about the ego like it's this bad thing. But the ego is really just the temporary identity that we take on while we incarnate. And a lot of the qualities that come with it are a couple of different things. A lot of them are really just compilations of qualities that we've had over other lifetimes, kind of repeated in this current incarnation. And it's also our interests, our desires, our passions, the things that bring us joy in life, and really the things that inspire us to make the world a better place. That comes from the ego too. And all of the things that kind of set us apart and make us individuals and give us that sense of separation. We wouldn't be able to experience that if we didn't have the ego. It's like a medium, you know what I mean? It's like a filter for allowing somebody to experience the individual I am. So I personally don't really resonate with the idea that it's necessarily like selfish to, want to have a good life for yourself or to create, good things for yourself. There's kind of I guess a misunderstanding of that within spiritual circles as well. People kind of seem to think that you need to like not want things, or you shouldn't want things, that it's wrong to want things for yourself, that it's selfish. You should only want things like if it's going to better other people too. But I don't necessarily think this is the case. I mean, I think part of the reason why we come down here into a material form is to experience the material world, and I think in a place of balance, there's nothing wrong with that. Of course, everything is a balancing act, and, there's extremes to everything. And I think, the part of the work of this journey is identifying that balance for ourselves and what works for us, and how we can kind of balance that that selfish want, or that want for things in the material, while also balancing the desire to help others and be of service. I think that's really the key, and the silver lining or the fine line that a person kind of has to walk on this journey. But I definitely don't think there's anything wrong with the ego. I think that it gets thrown around a lot in this line of work. People are like, oh, you're just operating from your ego or whatever. And it's like, we all are. We're all operating from our ego all the time. Like, nobody is more disconnected from their ego than anybody else, but you can transcend it, you know what I mean? And kind of observe it from a more neutral standpoint and understand, okay, this is who I am. These are the qualities that I possess in this current incarnation. How can I use these qualities, even if they may be in my shadow? How can I integrate these qualities and use them to make myself a better person, to be the best version of myself, and to make the world a better place? And I think when a person can do that, they become a very powerful force to be reckoned with, because then they don't allow their ego to consume them, and really make them a slave. Because I think that's the biggest problem with the modern world, is people are just a slave to their ego. It's not the ego itself that's the issue. It's the slavery and the ball and chain of sorts that it has over most of pretty much the Western world.
Interesting, yeah. Okay, we must be near end.
We are, yes. But I just think it's a very interesting time where we're having these sorts of conversations, and they're becoming more normal. And when I see things, I think, well, from a few years ago, the conversation has changed. It might still be a fringe group, but that fringe group is getting bigger. And I think it's just interesting to see how this will manifest on the world stage. As that grows, it has to have some effect. I think we're seeing that anyway, I believe. But
I agree. Yeah. And we're a part of it. Ultimately, even just this conversation that we're having right now, we're a part of that ripple effect that's going to completely maximize the reach of this wisdom. And, you know, like I said in the last interview that we had, you know, this is ultimately the wisdom that's going to make the world a better place and bring about things like world peace. I mean, that's totally within the realm of possibility with this kind of work.
Yeah, interesting. Watch this space, eh? Right.
Yeah. And hopefully you revisit us and maybe touch on the area. I know, I'm sure Gary's got other thoughts as well, and you might well have, Hannah, but of shadow work as well, because you sort of just touched on that there. And I think you could bring or shed some very nice light on that area for many people if you're willing to touch on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to come back and talk more about this subject with you guys, because I mean, there's just so much to be said. There really is.
Brilliant.
Brilliant.
Well, thank you once again, Hannah, for your time.
Thank you, Hannah.
Yeah,
We'll see
thank
you
you guys
again.
so much. I appreciate you. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day.
You too.
See you soon.